The spark of pride. Leonard Harrington sat in his lavish penthouse, the world sprawling beneath his feet. The city lights glittered in the night, reflecting in his crystal tumbler of scotch as he surveyed his empire. He was a man of unmatched success, his portfolio boasting skyscrapers, tech ventures, and a myriad of investments that kept his name in the headlines. Leonard enjoyed his place atop the food chain, believing his wealth justified his disdain for the underachievers below. On this particular evening, Leonard's eyes lingered on the city's less glamorous quarter, a patchwork of struggling businesses, aged apartment complexes, and parks dotted with children's laughter. It was an area he deemed wasted potential. "That neighborhood is a drain," Leonard muttered, swirling his drink. "It could be a gold mine if people knew what to do with it." His assistant, Gregory, stood by awkwardly, avoiding Leonard's gaze. "Sir, the redevelopment plans are ready. We're looking to buy out the last of the holdouts." "Good," Leonard replied, his tone clipped. "The sooner we replace that mess with condos, the better. People like that don't know how to use what they have anyway." Gregory hesitated. "There's still resistance from some community leaders." Leonard scoffed. "Resistance is just an obstacle waiting to be bought off. Raise the offers, or better yet, tighten the screws. They'll fold." The conversation ended as Leonard dismissed Gregory, his mind already moving to the next task. His confidence in his ability to reshape the world to his liking was unshakable. After all, Leonard Harrington didn't believe in failure. The following afternoon, Leonard decided to see the area for himself. His sleek, custom-built luxury car rolled through the neighborhood, an island of gleaming excess amidst a sea of modest homes and small businesses. The sound of children playing soccer in a nearby park caught his attention, a sharp contrast to the hum of urban activity. "Stop here," Leonard ordered his driver, stepping out onto the uneven sidewalk. His polished shoes clicked against the concrete as he surveyed the park. Children laughed and shouted, chasing a worn soccer ball. He wrinkled his nose. "This place," he muttered under his breath, "is exactly why we need progress." As he stood watching, the ball veered off course, rolling toward his car. A young boy, no older than 10, sprinted after it, oblivious to the billionaire's presence. Just as the boy reached for the ball, Leonard's sharp voice cut through the air. "Hey!" Leonard barked. The boy froze, wide-eyed. "I'm sorry, mister," he said, his small hands trembling as he pointed at the ball. It was an accident. Leonard's gaze narrowed on the faint scuff mark on the car's paint. His jaw tightened. "Do you have any idea how much this car costs?" The boy's lip quivered. "I didn't mean." Before he could finish, Leonard kicked the ball, sending it bouncing far into the street. The boy stared, his face crumpling in despair. "That's my ball. Maybe next time, you'll learn to watch where you're going," Leonard snapped. As Leonard turned to leave, the boy found his voice. "It wasn't fair," he said, his tone soft but firm. "I didn't mean to." Leonard stopped and glanced back, his expression icy. "Life isn't fair, kid. Learn that now." He walked away without another word, the boy's tear-filled eyes burning into his memory for only a fleeting moment. By the time Leonard was back in the car, reviewing development plans on his tablet, the incident was already forgotten. In the park, the boy, Jamari, sat on the pavement, clutching his scraped elbow, and watching the car disappear. A woman approached, kneeling beside him. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jamari nodded, though tears streaked his cheeks. "He didn't have to do that," he whispered. "I said I was sorry." The woman hugged him. "Some people are just cruel, Jamari. Don't let them make you think it's your fault." As others gathered to console Jamari, murmurs of anger spread. "Who does that to a kid?" One man muttered, shaking his head. Another woman added, "People like him think they're untouchable." But Jamari wasn't listening. He stared at the distant skyline, his young mind grappling with the injustice. "I'll show him," he thought, though he didn't yet know how. That evening, Leonard returned to his penthouse, his mood buoyed by the day's progress. Over dinner, he shared his plans with a group of investors. "We break ground next month," Leonard declared, raising his glass. "This city will finally see what real vision looks like." The table erupted in applause, but as Leonard toasted his success, the seeds of his undoing were already being sown. Unbeknownst to him, the boy he had so casually dismissed and the community he sought to erase were about to become the catalysts for his reckoning. The rising storm. Leonard Harrington awoke to the soft chime of his penthouse alarm, the gentle hum of the automated curtains revealing the sprawling cityscape. It was a morning like any other, until his phone buzzed with urgency. He glanced at the screen. A flood of notifications greeted him, their headlines cutting through the serenity. Billionaire's public outburst sparks outrage. Caught on camera, Leonard Harrington's insensitive park incident. Community outcry against Harrington development intensifies. Leonard frowned. Tapping on one of the articles, a video began to play. The grainy footage showed him towering over the boy in the park, his face twisted with irritation. The clip ended with him kicking the soccer ball into the street. The caption beneath read, "Man worth billions berates a child for scuffing his car." He tossed the phone onto the marble counter with a scowl. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. The video had clearly been taken without his consent. What right did anyone have to scrutinize his behavior? Minutes later, Gregory, his assistant, entered the penthouse with a nervous energy. "Sir, the board is asking for a statement. They're worried about how this might affect our public image." Leonard waved him off. "A statement? Over a soccer ball? This is nonsense." Gregory hesitated. "It's gaining traction, sir. Community leaders are using it to highlight your history of less than favorable interactions with low-income areas." Leonard's eyes narrowed. "History? What history?" Gregory cleared his throat. "The evictions, the redevelopment projects, the tactics you've employed." Leonard scoffed. "Tactics? I followed the law. If people can't keep up, that's their problem, not mine." But Gregory didn't look convinced. Neither did the board when Leonard joined an emergency video call later that morning. "Leonard," began Evelyn Shaw, the head of public relations, "this isn't just a PR issue. It's a firestorm. That video has gone viral, and the community is rallying against us. It's a distraction," Leonard said flatly. "We stay the course." Evelyn shook her head. "Staying the course isn't an option when half the city's talking about boycotts and protests." Leonard leaned back in his chair, his lips tightening. He was not accustomed to being questioned, let alone cornered. Let them protest. They'll tire themselves out. But Evelyn wasn't finished. "It's not just the protests, Leonard. Investors are getting cold feet. Some of them are already pulling out." Leonard froze. Pulling out. He straightened in his chair, over a video of a kid in a car. "Ridiculous." "It's not just the video," Evelyn said, her voice sharp now. "It's what it represents. People see this as the culmination of years of your arrogance and disregard for anyone who isn't part of your world. It's not just bad press, Leonard. It's personal to them." By the end of the day, Leonard's frustration had turned to anger. Calls with investors became arguments, and attempts at damage control were dismissed as overreactions. That evening, he retreated to his favorite pastime, surveying the city from his balcony, the glimmering skyline a testament to his accomplishments. Yet, as he looked out, his eyes drifted toward the same neighborhood he had visited the day before. For the first time, he didn't see a cluster of decrepit buildings waiting to be replaced. He saw the park, the boy's tear-filled eyes, and the faces of the adults who had glared at him in silent judgment. "Fools," he muttered, shaking his head. "They don't understand progress." But a seed of doubt had been planted. The protests began the next morning. What had started as a handful of people holding signs outside one of Harrington Corporation's offices quickly grew into a movement. Word spread through social media, fueled by the viral video. Hashtags like #JusticeForJamari and #HarringtonExposed trended worldwide. Local leaders organized marches, tying the park incident to a broader narrative of systemic exploitation. Families who had been displaced by Leonard's developments shared their stories. Business owners spoke of how their livelihoods had been destroyed when Leonard bought out their blocks. Even former employees began to step forward, recounting tales of mistreatment and unethical practices. Leonard watched the news coverage from his office, his jaw tightening with each passing report. Protesters chanted outside the Harrington Tower, holding signs that read, "This is our home," and "Stop Harrington." Gregory appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Sir, the police are struggling to contain the crowds, and the mayor's office is calling, again." Leonard slammed his fist on the desk. "The mayor? What does he want now?" "To mediate," Gregory replied cautiously. "They're asking if you'd be willing to meet with community leaders." Leonard laughed bitterly. "Meet with them? To what end? They're not going to change my mind." Gregory didn't respond, but the silence spoke volumes. Days turned into weeks, and the protests only grew. Investors began withdrawing en masse, and the board became increasingly restless. Evelyn Shaw requested another emergency meeting, her tone grim. "This is unsustainable," she said, her usual composure fraying. "We've lost 3 major contracts this week alone. Leonard, we need to show good faith." Leonard glared at her. "Good faith? What does that mean?" "Giving in to their demands." "It means acknowledging their concerns," Evelyn replied firmly. "This isn't just about the video. This is years of resentment boiling over. If we don't act now, there won't be a company left to save." For the first time, Leonard felt a flicker of uncertainty, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. "We're not bowing to a mob," he said. Evelyn sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Then I hope you're prepared for what comes next." That night, Leonard sat alone in his penthouse, the silence oppressive. He poured himself another glass of scotch, staring at the city below. The headlines on his phone grew darker. Reports of shareholder lawsuits, employee resignations, and mounting legal troubles. He thought of the boy, Jamari. The scuff mark on the car, the trembling voice apologizing for an accident. Leonard had dismissed it all as insignificant, a fleeting moment in a life filled with far more pressing concerns. But now, that moment was unraveling everything he had built, and for the first time, Leonard began to wonder if Evelyn was right. Maybe it wasn't just about the boy or the car. Maybe it was about something far bigger. The thought gnawed at him, and as he sat staring at the skyline, the city he had once controlled now seemed impossibly distant, untouchable. The world was shifting beneath his feet, and Leonard Harrington, the man who had always believed he was invincible, didn't know how to stop it. The cracks deepened. The morning began with Leonard Harrington staring blankly at the ceiling of his penthouse bedroom. The sunlight streamed in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but it brought no warmth to the cold emptiness he felt inside. His once proud empire was crumbling around him, and for the first time in his life, Leonard didn't have a plan to fix it. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. With a heavy sigh, he reached for it, expecting another barrage of bad news. Instead, it was a text from Evelyn Shaw. "Evelyn, the board has scheduled an emergency meeting at noon. Attendance is mandatory." Leonard set the phone down without responding. His company, his life's work, was slipping through his fingers. But worse than the financial losses was the gnawing sense of humiliation. The world, it seemed, was relishing his downfall. At noon, Leonard stepped into the boardroom, his usual commanding presence muted. The air was tense, and the once friendly faces of his board members now carried a mix of pity and frustration. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, her sharp features as unyielding as ever. "Let's get straight to the point," she began, her voice cutting through the silence. "Our financial situation is dire. Investors are pulling out faster than we can stabilize. and the protests. They've made us a target for every activist group in the city. Leonard leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. We've faced challenges before. This isn't any different. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. This is very different. The difference, Leonard, is you. You've become a liability. The word hung in the air like a sharp blade. Leonard straightened, his jaw tightening. A liability. I built this company. And now you're tearing it down. Evelyn shot back. The video, the backlash, the protests. These aren't isolated incidents. They're a direct response to the way you've treated people for years. The board has had enough. Leonard looked around the room, searching for an ally. Gregory, sitting near the corner, avoided his gaze. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one spoke up. Evelyn continued. Effective immediately, the board is voting to remove you as CEO. Leonard slammed his fist on the table, his voice rising. You can't do this. I am Harrington Corporation. Without me, there is no company. Evelyn's expression didn't falter. That's where you're wrong. This company has to survive, and it can't do that with you at the helm. The vote was swift and unanimous. As Leonard's nameplate was removed from the desk, a sense of disbelief washed over him. He stood, his chest heaving with anger, and pointed at Evelyn. You'll regret this. She met his gaze evenly. We'll take our chances. That evening, Leonard found himself in the back of a town car, heading back to his penthouse. The city lights blurred as he stared out the window, his thoughts racing. His entire world was unraveling. His company, his reputation, his power. He clenched his fists, his mind replaying Evelyn's words. You've become a liability. As the car pulled up to his building, Leonard noticed a crowd gathered outside. Protesters. Their signs were a mix of scathing critiques and heartful pleas. End corporate greed. Save our homes. Justice for Jamari. Leonard tightened his jaw and stepped out of the car, ignoring the shouts and cameras flashing around him. Security guards pushed back the crowd as he made his way inside, but the voices followed him, echoing in his mind. The next day, Leonard sat in his penthouse office, his desk cluttered with documents from his legal team. Lawsuits were piling up, investors seeking damages, community groups filing injunctions, even former employees alleging unfair practices. Each file was another weight pressing down on him. His phone buzzed, and he picked it up to see a message from his lawyer. Lawyer, the IRS is opening an investigation into your finances. We need to meet ASAP. Leonard tossed the phone aside, a sense of dread settling in his chest. The IRS investigation was just another layer to the nightmare. His accounts were already frozen, his property seized, and his reputation tarnished. What more could they take? That evening, as Leonard sat in his darkened living room, a familiar face appeared on the news. Jamari, the boy from the park. He stood in front of a small crowd, holding his mother's hand. A reporter's microphone was thrust toward him. What do you hope comes out of all this, Jamari? The reporter asked. Jamari hesitated, glancing at his mother. She nodded, encouraging him to speak. I just want people to treat each other better, Jamari said, his voice soft but steady. It's not about money or cars. It's about being kind. The crowd cheered, and the camera panned to his mother, Clara. Her voice was firm, filled with quiet strength. This isn't just about my son. It's about the way people like Leonard Harrington think they can treat others. We're here to say enough is enough. Leonard turned off the TV, his hand trembling. Jamari's words echoed in his mind. It's about being kind. For the first time, Leonard felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Regret. The following weeks brought more challenges. Leonard's penthouse, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a prison. The protests outside his building grew louder, and the legal battles showed no signs of slowing. Even Veronica, his estranged wife, refused to answer his calls. She had taken their children and retreated to their vacation home, leaving Leonard alone with his thoughts. One night, as he sat by the window, watching the city lights, he heard a knock at the door. Surprised, he rarely had visitors. He opened it to find Gregory standing there, looking uneasy. "What do you want?" Leonard asked, his voice weary. Gregory hesitated before stepping inside. "I came to say goodbye." Leonard frowned. "Goodbye?" "I've resigned," Gregory said, avoiding Leonard's gaze. "The company, it's not what it used to be. And I can't keep cleaning up your messes." Leonard felt a surge of anger but swallowed it. "So, you're abandoning me, just like everyone else." Gregory sighed. "You abandoned everyone else a long time ago, Leonard. You just didn't notice." With that, Gregory left, leaving Leonard standing alone in the doorway. His words lingered, cutting deeper than Leonard cared to admit. That night, as Leonard lay in bed, sleep eluded him. The weight of his choices, his pride, his cruelty, his relentless pursuit of power, pressed down on him. For the first time, he began to wonder if he was the villain in his own story. The cracks in Leonard's life were no longer just in his company or his finances. They were in his very identity. And as the world continued to crumble around him, Leonard Harrington faced a question he had never considered before. Was it too late to change? A mirror held up. The days that followed were a blur for Leonard Harrington, his once orderly life now a chaotic tangle of lawsuits, frozen assets, and relentless public scrutiny. He barely left his penthouse, the protesters outside a constant reminder of his fall from grace. Their chants reached him even from the heights of his sanctuary, echoing in his mind until they became as relentless as his own self-doubt. This morning, however, was different. A court-ordered notice arrived at his door, delivered by a stone-faced officer. Leonard opened it with trembling hands. Notice of foreclosure. The words stared back at him, cold and final. His penthouse, the crown jewel of his empire, was no longer his. He was being evicted. Leonard sank into the nearest chair, the notice slipping from his fingers. The room, once his sanctuary, now felt foreign and oppressive. The gleaming marble floors, the priceless art on the walls, none of it mattered anymore. He had lost the only thing that had ever defined him, his control. 2 days later, Leonard stood in the lobby of his building, a battered suitcase at his side. The protesters outside cheered as he stepped out onto the street, cameras flashing in his face. "Leonard Harrington, any comment on your eviction? Do you feel any remorse for what you did to Jamari? What's next for you, Leonard?" He ignored them, his face a mask of stoic defiance, and walked toward the taxi waiting at the curb. As the car pulled away, Leonard caught a final glimpse of the protest signs: justice for the community, and no more Harrington. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had once commanded the skyline was now a passenger in a dingy cab, driven away from the city he had once ruled. Leonard checked into a small motel on the outskirts of the city. The room was a far cry from his penthouse. A threadbare carpet, a lumpy mattress, and a flickering fluorescent light. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his choices. The faces of those he had hurt swam before him. The families he had evicted, the employees he had dismissed without a second thought, and Jamari, the boy who had been the unwitting catalyst for his downfall. Leonard couldn't shake the image of Jamari's tear-streaked face as he clutched his scraped elbow. Why had he been so cruel? He'd thought himself untouchable, above the petty concerns of others. But now, stripped of his power and wealth, Leonard was beginning to understand the consequences of his actions. The next day, Leonard ventured into the city, his appearance unkempt and his once impeccable suit replaced by plain, wrinkled clothes. He wandered aimlessly, drawn by some unseen force to the neighborhood he had once despised. As he turned a corner, he found himself in front of the same park where it had all begun. Children were playing soccer, their laughter filling the air. Leonard stopped, watching them from a distance. He felt a pang of longing, not for the life he'd lost, but for the innocence he had so casually dismissed. "Hey," a voice called out behind him. Leonard turned to see a woman approaching. It was Clara, Jemari's mother. Her expression was guarded, her arms crossed over her chest. "I almost didn't recognize you," she said, her tone sharp. "What are you doing here?" Leonard hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Finally, he said, "I don't know. I guess. I wanted to see the park again." Clara's eyes narrowed. "The park where you humiliated my son." He winced at her words, unable to meet her gaze. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what I did to Jemari. For everything." Clara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Sorry doesn't fix what you've done, but it's a start." She turned to leave, but Leonard called after her. "How is he?" "Jemari." Clara paused. "He's stronger than you think. He's been helping the community rally against people like you." Her words stung, but Leonard nodded. "He's a good kid." Clara didn't respond. She walked away, leaving Leonard alone in the park. Leonard spent the rest of the day wandering the neighborhood. He passed the shuttered businesses, the dilapidated buildings, and the people who had borne the brunt of his greed. For the first time, he saw them, not as obstacles or liabilities, but as human beings. He stopped in front of a small house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. A group of people was gathered outside, unloading boxes of food from a truck. Among them was Jemari. Leonard hesitated, unsure if he should approach. But Jemari spotted him and froze, his eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. Harrington?" he asked, his voice a mix of surprise and confusion. Leonard stepped closer, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Hi, Jemari. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what I did." Jemari studied him, his young face thoughtful. "Why now?" he asked. "Why are you sorry now?" Leonard sighed. "Because I was wrong. I thought I was better than everyone else. I wasn't. I'm not." Jemari nodded slowly, as if considering his words. Then he gestured toward the boxes. "If you're really sorry, you can help." Leonard blinked. "Help?" "Yeah," Jemari said, picking up a box. "We're delivering food to families who need it." For a moment, Leonard hesitated. Then he nodded. "Okay." The hours that followed were unlike anything Leonard had experienced. He carried boxes into homes that were far smaller and humbler than anything he'd ever known. He met families who greeted him with cautious smiles, their gratitude tempered by the knowledge of who he was. One elderly woman, whose hands trembled as she accepted a box of canned goods, looked him in the eye and said, "Funny how life turns, isn't it?" Leonard nodded, her words echoing in his mind. As the day turned to evening, Leonard found himself sitting on the steps of the community center, his muscles aching but his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Jemari sat beside him, munching on a piece of cornbread. "You're not what I expected," Jemari said, his tone curious. Leonard glanced at him. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," Jemari admitted. "Someone who wouldn't care. Someone who wouldn't try." Leonard chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "I didn't care, Jemari. Not for a long time. But I'm trying now." Jemari smiled, a small but genuine gesture. "Mama always says it's never too late to start over." As Leonard looked out at the neighborhood he had once dismissed, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to rebuild. Not buildings, not businesses, but bridges. And he vowed to spend whatever time he had left doing just that. Seeds of redemption. Leonard Harrington woke to the sounds of the bustling neighborhood, children laughing, street vendors shouting, and the hum of life he had once dismissed as noise. He was no longer in his sterile penthouse, but in a small, makeshift room lent to him by Clara and Jemari. The bed was lumpy, the walls were thin, and yet, for reasons he couldn't fully understand, Leonard felt a strange sense of peace. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft shadows on the walls. Leonard sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The faint aroma of coffee and frying eggs wafted in from the kitchen. For the first time in weeks, he didn't dread the day ahead. In the kitchen, Clara was busy cooking, while Jamari scribbled on a piece of paper at the table. Michael, Clara's husband, leaned against the counter, his arms crossed as he eyed Leonard with a mix of suspicion and begrudging tolerance. "You're up early," Michael said, his tone clipped. "I couldn't sleep," Leonard replied, shifting awkwardly. He hesitated before adding, "Do you need help with anything?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "Help? From you?" Leonard nodded, ignoring the sting of the remark. "Yes. Whatever needs doing." Michael exchanged a glance with Clara, who shrugged. "The community center could use more hands," she said. "There's still a lot of work to do before it reopens." Leonard nodded, grateful for the opportunity. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. Jamari looked up from his drawing and grinned. "We're painting the walls today. Mama says we're using happy colors." Leonard smiled faintly. Happy colors sound good. The community center was a hive of activity when Leonard arrived with Clara, Michael, and Jamari. Volunteers bustled about, carrying paint cans, hammering nails, and arranging donated furniture. The building, once neglected and crumbling, was slowly transforming into a vibrant hub of hope. Leonard found himself paired with a group of teenagers tasked with painting the main hall. At first, they eyed him warily, whispering among themselves. Leonard couldn't blame them. His face had been plastered all over the news, and his reputation was hardly endearing. One of the boys, a tall teenager with a serious expression, finally broke the silence. "So, why are you here? Aren't you, like a billionaire or something?" Leonard dipped his brush into the bright yellow paint, choosing his words carefully. "I used to be. Not anymore." The boy frowned. "Why not?" "Because I made mistakes," Leonard admitted, his voice quiet. "Big ones. And now I'm trying to make up for them." The boy considered this for a moment before nodding. "Well, you better not mess up the painting," he said with a smirk. The others laughed, and the tension eased. As the day went on, Leonard fell into the rhythm of the work. He painted walls, carried supplies, and even helped fix a leaky faucet in the kitchen. The physical labor was exhausting, but it was a welcome distraction from the chaos of his old life. During a break, Leonard sat outside on the steps of the community center, wiping sweat from his brow. Jamari joined him, holding 2 bottles of water. "Here," Jamari said, handing one to Leonard. "Thanks," Leonard replied, twisting off the cap and taking a long drink. He glanced at Jamari, who was staring out at the street, deep in thought. "What's on your mind?" Leonard asked. Jamari shrugged. "I was just thinking. You used to be really mean. But now you're not. What changed?" Leonard hesitated, the question catching him off guard. "I guess. I realized how wrong I was. I thought being rich and powerful made me better than other people. But it didn't. It just made me blind." Jamari looked at him, his young face serious. "Mama says everyone deserves a second chance, but only if they work for it." Leonard smiled faintly. "Your mom's a wise woman." That evening, the volunteers gathered in the community center's main hall to celebrate their progress. Someone had brought a portable speaker, and music filled the room as people danced and laughed. A table was set up with food. Simple dishes made from donated ingredients, but they were shared with a warmth and generosity that touched Leonard deeply. Clara stood up at one point, addressing the group. "We've come a long way, but there's still work to do. This center isn't just a building. It's a place for our kids to learn, for our families to gather, and for our community to grow. Thank you all for being part of this." The crowd erupted into applause, and Leonard found himself clapping along. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. The next morning, Leonard returned to the community center, determined to keep contributing. He worked alongside Michael, fixing broken chairs and assembling donated bookshelves. Though Michael was still guarded, there were moments of camaraderie, small exchanges that hinted at a growing respect. In the afternoon, Leonard was asked to join a meeting with the community leaders. Clara introduced him to the group, and the room fell silent as everyone turned to face him. "This is Leonard Harrington," Clara said. "You all know who he is and what he's done. But he's here because he wants to help. I think we should give him the chance to prove it." A man in his 50s, his face lined with years of hard work and struggle, spoke up. "Mr. Harrington, why should we trust you? You've taken so much from us. What makes us think you won't do it again?" Leonard met the man's gaze, his voice steady but humble. "You're right not to trust me. I've done things I'm not proud of, and I can't undo the harm I've caused. But I'm here to listen, to learn, and to help in any way I can. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope to earn it." The room was silent for a long moment before the man nodded. "We'll see what you're made of." Over the next few weeks, Leonard threw himself into the work. He organized fundraisers, secured donations from contacts who hadn't completely turned their backs on him, and even used his knowledge of city planning to navigate bureaucratic hurdles. Slowly but surely, the community began to warm to him. But Leonard knew he still had a long way to go. Every act of kindness, every step toward redemption, was a reminder of the damage he had done. He couldn't erase his past, but he could build a better future, brick by brick, step by step. And for the first time in his life, Leonard Harrington felt like he was truly making a difference. Building bridges. As Leonard's days bowled into weeks, the community began to take notice of his unwavering commitment. The once scornful whispers turned to cautious curiosity. Leonard wasn't just talking about change, he was putting in the work. One afternoon, Leonard sat on the steps of the community center, poring over a pile of papers. It was a grant application, something the community had struggled to secure for years. Clara joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. Leonard looked up, offering a small smile. "I have to be. For too long, I used what I knew to hurt people. Now I want to use it to help." Clara nodded, her eyes scanning his face. "The others are starting to see it. You're not the man you were." Leonard chuckled lightly. "I hope not. That man was blind to everything that mattered." The next big milestone was the community center's reopening. Leonard worked tirelessly alongside the residents, transforming the building into a vibrant space filled with art, books, and opportunities. The final touches were being made on the day of the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Banners hung from the walls, and tables were piled high with food donated by local businesses. As the ceremony began, Clara stood at the front, microphone in hand, addressing the crowd that had gathered. "This place is more than just a building," she began, her voice strong and clear. "It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together. And while this center exists because of all of you, I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone who's shown us that change is possible." Leonard froze, his heart pounding. "Leonard Harrington," Clara said, gesturing for him to join her. "Come up here." The crowd turned to him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and cautious approval. Leonard stood, his legs shaky, and made his way to the front. Taking the microphone, he looked out at the faces of the people he had wronged. "I don't deserve this," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I've done things I'm not proud of, things that hurt this community in ways I'll never fully understand. But you've given me a chance to make things right, and I promise I won't waste it." The crowd was silent for a moment before a smattering of applause broke out, growing louder until it filled the room. Leonard stepped back, overwhelmed by the unexpected support. That night, as the celebration wound down, Leonard found himself standing by the community center's mural, a vibrant depiction of the neighborhood's history. Chameri appeared beside him, clutching a plate of cake. "You did good today," Chameri said, his eyes bright. Leonard smiled, crouching down to Jamari's level. I had a lot of help. Jamari tilted his head thoughtfully. Mama says helping people isn't about being big or strong. It's about caring. Leonard placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Your mama's a smart woman. Jamari grinned. She says you're getting there. Leonard laughed softly, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was truly part of something. The following week, Leonard's commitment was put to the test in an unexpected way. Donald Green, a former associate and one of the city's most ruthless developers, paid him a surprise visit at the community center. Donald was impeccably dressed, his grin oozing insincerity. Leonard, he said, extending a hand. Good to see you. Leonard stood, crossing his arms. Donald, what brings you here? Donald gestured grandly at the community center. This place is impressive. I heard about the work you've been doing here. Very noble. What do you want? Leonard asked, his tone flat. Donald's grin widened. An opportunity. This neighborhood is sitting on prime real estate, and my investors are eager to move in. You've got the trust of these people now. You could convince them to sell. Leonard's jaw tightened. Not a chance. Donald chuckled, pulling out a check and holding it up. Think about it, Leonard. This is just the start. You could make a fortune and redeem yourself in the eyes of the business world. Leonard stared at the check, the number written on it astronomical. The old Leonard would have taken it without a second thought. But now, the idea made his stomach turn. No, Leonard said firmly, stepping closer to Donald. These people have been through enough. I won't betray them. Donald's smile faltered. Careful, Leonard. You're burning the few bridges you have left. Leonard met his gaze without flinching. Some bridges deserve to be burned. Donald shook his head, pocketing the check. Suit yourself, but don't come crawling back when you realize you've got nothing left. As Donald walked away, Leonard felt a surge of clarity. For the first time, he didn't feel torn between his past and his future. He knew where he stood, and it was with the community. That evening, Leonard joined the residents for a neighborhood meeting. They were planning their next steps, securing more funding, organizing workshops for the kids, and expanding their food drive. As Leonard listened, he felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. When the meeting ended, Clara approached him. You stood your ground today, she said, her eyes searching his face. Leonard nodded. It wasn't a hard choice. Clara smiled faintly. You're not the same man who kicked a boy's ball into the street. Leonard looked at her, his expression serious. I'm trying not to be. She nodded, her smile softening. Keep trying. As the night deepened, Leonard walked home through the neighborhood, the cool air carrying the faint sounds of laughter and music. He had lost everything he once thought mattered. His wealth, his power, his reputation. But in their place, he had found something far more meaningful. Connection, purpose, and the chance to rebuild, not just his life, but the lives of those he had hurt. And for Leonard Harrington, that was a redemption worth fighting for. A new legacy. Months had passed since Leonard Harrington began his journey toward redemption. The neighborhood he once sought to destroy had become his home, its people his unlikely allies. But the road was far from smooth, and Leonard knew that earning trust was a lifelong endeavor, not a task to be checked off a list. The community center was thriving, now a hub of activity. Children attended after-school programs, parents held meetings to discuss neighborhood issues, and volunteers ran workshops in everything from carpentry to computer literacy. Leonard had helped facilitate these changes, but he knew his role was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. One chilly morning, Leonard arrived at the community center to find Clara waiting for him outside. Her breath misted in the air as she handed him a steaming cup of coffee. You're early, she remarked. Leonard smiled. Can't stay away. Clara chuckled softly, her gaze drifting to the building. You've done good here. The center is better than it's ever been. Leonard sipped his coffee, feeling a rare warmth in her words. We all did this. Together. Her expression softened, but before she could respond, Jamari came bounding out of the building, a wide grin on his face. Mr. Leonard, Mama, come see, he shouted, beckoning them inside. Leonard and Clara followed Jamari into the main hall, where a group of children stood around a mural that had been unveiled overnight. It depicted the neighborhood's history, vibrant markets, families working together, and a bright future symbolized by the sun rising over the community center. At the center of it all was an image of Jamari, holding a soccer ball, standing tall and proud. It's amazing, Clara said, her voice tinged with emotion. Leonard stared at the mural, his throat tightening. It's perfect. Jamari grinned. They even painted my scar. He pointed to a small mark on the mural version of himself, a detail that symbolized his resilience rather than a flaw. The mural became a centerpiece of the community, a reminder of their collective strength and the promise of brighter days ahead. Later that week, Leonard received a surprising invitation. Evelyn Shaw, his former head of public relations, reached out to request a meeting. Curious but wary, Leonard agreed to meet her at a small cafe near the edge of the neighborhood. When he arrived, Evelyn was already seated, her polished demeanor unchanged. She looked up as he approached, her eyes narrowing slightly at his casual attire, faded jeans, and a worn jacket that now felt more like a uniform than his once tailored suits. Leonard, she greeted, her tone guarded. Evelyn, he replied, sitting across from her. To what do I owe the pleasure? She folded her hands neatly on the table. I've been keeping tabs on you. It seems you've changed. Leonard smirked. That's one way to put it. Evelyn leaned forward. There's an opportunity here, Leonard. People love a redemption story. With the right PR, you could rebuild your reputation, maybe even get back into the business world. Leonard's expression darkened. Is that why you're here? To offer me a way back into the same world that nearly destroyed me? Evelyn frowned. I'm offering you a chance to leverage your story for something bigger. Leonard shook his head. I'm already doing something bigger, Evelyn. Right here, in this neighborhood. She studied him for a moment before sighing. I underestimated you, Leonard. I hope you know what you're doing. I do, he said firmly, standing to leave. And it's not about me anymore. Back at the community center, Leonard found himself drawn into a planning meeting for the upcoming block party, a celebration of the neighborhood's progress. Clara, Michael, and other residents were abuzz with ideas, from food stalls to live music. You should speak, Clara suggested, looking directly at Leonard. He hesitated. I don't think anyone wants to hear from me. Michael, who had grown less hostile over the months, nodded in agreement. You've done the work, Harrington. You've earned it. Leonard swallowed hard. The thought of addressing the crowd filled him with both dread and a deep sense of responsibility. All right, he said quietly. I'll do it. The day of the block party arrived. The neighborhood transformed into a lively festival. Children ran through the streets with painted faces, while vendors sold homemade goods and local bands filled the air with music. The sense of joy was palpable, a stark contrast to the tension and despair that had once hung over the area. As evening fell, Clara took the stage to address the crowd. She spoke of the neighborhood's resilience, its ability to overcome adversity, and the power of unity. Then she gestured toward Leonard. Tonight, I want to invite someone to speak, she said. Someone who's shown us that it's never too late to change. The crowd fell silent as Leonard stepped onto the stage, the lights casting a warm glow over the sea of faces. He gripped the microphone, his heart pounding. I don't know where to start, he began, his voice steadied despite his nerves. So I'll start with the truth. I was wrong. For years, I thought my success made me better than others. I believed that money and power gave me the right to take what I wanted, no matter the cost. He paused, scanning the crowd. But I was blind to the strength and beauty of this community, blind to the harm I was causing. And it took losing everything for me to see clearly. Leonard's voice grew firmer. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I'm here because I want to make amends. Because this neighborhood, the people here, taught me something I never learned in all my years of success. What it means to truly care for others. The crowd was quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the audience, building until it became a roar. Leonard stepped back, overwhelmed by the response. Chameri ran up to him, grinning. You did good, Mr. Leonard. Leonard knelt, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Thanks, Chamari, but it's you and your mom who've done the real work. As the block party wound down, Leonard stood at the edge of the park, watching the community he had once tried to dismantle. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Michael. You're one of us now, Michael said simply. Leonard nodded, emotion tightening his throat. I hope I can live up to that. You already have, Michael replied before walking away. Leonard stood there for a long time, the sounds of laughter and music fading into the night. For the first time in his life, he felt at peace, not because of what he had, but because of who he was becoming. And for Leonard Harrington, that was the only legacy worth leaving behind. Closing the chapter, as the night deepened and the block party wound down, Leonard Harrington found himself walking through the park, its lamplights casting a warm glow over the emptying space. The once barren park now teemed with life, its benches freshly painted, the playground rebuilt, and a small garden blooming at its center. He paused by the mural on the community center wall, running his fingers over the painted surface. It was more than just a piece of art. It was a testament to resilience, to the strength of a community that had refused to be erased. And in a way, it was a testament to his own transformation. The sound of soft footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Clara approaching, her arms crossed against the chill of the night. Couldn't sleep, she asked, her voice calm. Leonard shook his head. Too much on my mind. Clara joined him, her eyes drifting to the mural. You've come a long way, Leonard. We've all seen it. He glanced at her, a faint smile on his lips. I had good teachers. Clara chuckled. Don't get too comfortable. There's still work to do. I wouldn't have it any other way, Leonard replied, his voice sincere. They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Clara turned to him, her expression softening. You know, when you first came back, I didn't think it was possible for you to change. But you proved me wrong. Leonard met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion, for giving me the chance. Clara nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. Don't thank me. Thank Chameri. He's the one who saw something in you before the rest of us did. Leonard chuckled, shaking his head. That boy has more courage than most adults I've met. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The community center continued to flourish, with new programs and partnerships bringing resources and opportunities to the neighborhood. Leonard threw himself into the work, finding purpose in every task, no matter how small. One afternoon, as he was repairing a fence near the park, Chameri approached him with a bright smile. Mr. Leonard, he said, holding up a handmade flyer, we're starting a soccer league. Mama says you should be the coach. Leonard laughed, taking the flyer. Me? A coach? I don't know anything about soccer. Chameri grinned. You'll learn, just like you learned to paint. Leonard shook his head, a warm smile spreading across his face. All right, kid, you've got yourself a coach. Months turned into a year, and Leonard's life became a reflection of the community he had once sought to destroy. The Harrington Corporation was a distant memory, its name erased from the city's skyline, but Leonard didn't mourn its loss. In its place, he found something far more meaningful. Connection, trust, and the chance to rebuild. Not buildings, but relationships. One day, as Leonard stood in the park watching Chameri's soccer team practice, Clara joined him. She handed him a cup of coffee, a familiar ritual that had come to symbolize their growing friendship. "They're good," Leonard said, nodding toward the field. "They've got a good coach," Clara replied, her tone teasing. Leonard chuckled. "They'd got good hearts. That's what matters." Clara looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "You know, Leonard, you've done something remarkable here. But it's not just about the work you've done for the community. It's about who you've become." Leonard met her gaze, the weight of her words settling over him. "I'm not the same man I was, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I never go back." Clara smiled. "I believe you." As the sun began to set, casting the park in a golden light, Leonard felt a sense of peace he had never known before. His journey was far from over, but he was no longer walking it alone. The community he had once dismissed had become his family, and the legacy he was building was one of hope, not harm. For Leonard Harrington, the man who had lost everything to find himself, the future was no longer something to control or fear. It was a gift to be cherished, one step at a time. And as he stood among the people who had taught him the true meaning of redemption, Leonard knew he was finally home.